What if the quiet rhythm of day and night was never truly guaranteed, but instead something that had to be slowly created out of chaos? In the earliest ages of Earth, the planet did not move with the calm certainty we know today. It turned faster, its rotation restless, as if it had not yet learned how to settle. Days were shorter, nights arrived too quickly, and the boundary between light and darkness felt less like a rhythm and more like a flake. The sky itself seemed heavier, filled with unfamiliar gases that softened the sunlight, giving the world a muted and fiatine ferme. There was no reliable pattern to follow, no steady cycle that life could trust. Even the seasons, which now arrive with quiet predictability, did not yet exist in any familiar form. The planet's axis, slightly tilted, refused to remain still over vast stretches of time. It drifted, shifting its angle in slow, unpredictable ways. Regions that once faced warmth could gradually turn toward cold, not because of a stable seasonal cycle, but because the planet itself could not decide how to hold its position. In some ages, climates grew extreme, stretching into long periods of heat, only to shift later into quiet, enduring cold. The oceans responded to this instability with movements that lacked rhythm. Without a nearby companion to guide them, their tides were shaped mostly by the distant pull of the sun. The result was subtle yet deeply uneven. Waters rose and fell, but not with the steady breathing we see today. Instead, coastlines experienced irregular surges, long pauses, and shifting patterns that made the boundary between land and sea feel uncertain. The world was not violent, but it was unsettled, as if it was still searching for a balance it had not yet discovered. And within this restless system, something important was missing, though nothing in the sky made that absence obvious. There was no constant presence to steady the planet, no nearby partner to anchor its motion. Earth moved alone, and in that solitude its behavior remained uncertain. It is easy to imagine that the world has always been as it is now, that the rising sun and the turning seasons are permanent features of reality. But this early Earth suggests something different. Stability was not given. It was not part of the planet's original design. It had to emerge slowly, through processes that had not yet begun. Life, if it was present at all, existed within this shifting environment, adapting not to a steady world, but to one that changed without warning. Every cycle was uncertain, every pattern temporary, and yet beneath this quiet instability, the conditions for something more stable were slowly forming, though nothing on the surface revealed it clearly. The planet continued to turn, to tilt, to shift, carrying within it the possibility of a different future. The question was not whether Earth could remain this way, but how it could ever become something more balanced, more predictable, more alive. And as the planet moved through space, that answer was already beginning to approach. Still distant, still unseen, yet quietly inevitable. It would not arrive as a gentle adjustment, nor as something the planet could create on its own. The change would come from beyond, from a presence not yet part of Earth's story. Until then, the world remained suspended in this quiet uncertainty, turning through its restless cycles, waiting without knowing that its future stability depended on something it had never known. And so the early Earth continued as it was, a planet without rhythm, moving through time without memory, without repetition, without the quiet certainty that would one day define it. The silence of space offered no answers, only distance, only motion, only the sense that something was missing, and that its absence mattered more than anything yet understood. Story was justice. Beneath the surface of this early world, forces were moving in ways no eye could ever witness, shaping a planet that had not yet decided what it would become. The ground itself was not stable, not fixed, but constantly shifting, folding, and reforming. Vast regions of molten rock pushed upward from deep within, breaking through the surface in long, glowing fractures. Volcanoes did not rise as isolated mountains, but as entire landscapes of fire stretching across the horizon, pouring heat into the sky. The crust, still thin and uncertain, struggled to contain the energy below it, and so it yielded again and again, reshaping itself in slow, relentless motion. Above this restless ground, the atmosphere hung thick and unfamiliar. It was not the clear sky we recognize today, but a dense mixture of gases that scattered sunlight into a dim, muted glow. The sun was present, yet distant in feeling. Its light filtered through layers that softened its warmth. Days passed without clarity, as if the world itself existed behind a veil. The air carried the memory of constant change, holding heat in some moments, releasing it in others, never settling into balance. And beyond the atmosphere, the wider space around Earth offered no safety. Objects still moved through the young solar system on uncertain paths, remnants of a time when planets were still forming. From time to time, these fragments found their way toward Earth, entering the atmosphere in sudden flashes, striking the surface with immense force. Each impact reminded the planet that it was not isolated, that its environment extended far beyond its own boundaries. The ground absorbed these encounters, reshaping again, carrying the marks of collisions that arrived without warning. The oceans, though already present, did not behave as calm, stable bodies of water, without a nearby force to guide them. Their movements were irregular, influenced only by the distant pull of the sun. Tides rose and fell, but without a steady rhythm. At times the waters lingered along the edges of land, barely shifting. At other times they moved more noticeably, though never with the reliable pattern that would later define them. The boundary between land and sea remained uncertain, constantly adjusting, never fully settled. All of these forces, rising heat, shifting crust, heavy skies, distant impacts, and restless oceans, were connected by something less visible, something even more fundamental. The planet itself was not anchored in its motion. Its axis, the invisible line around which it turned, wandered over time. Not suddenly, not in ways that could be seen in a single lifetime, but gradually, over immense stretches of time. The tilt shifted, and with it, the way sunlight reached different parts of the planet. This wandering created a world where climate could not remain consistent. Regions that once experienced warmth could slowly drift into colder conditions, while others moved toward greater heat. There was no reliable pattern, no repeating cycle that life could anticipate. Entire environments changed not because of sudden events, but because the planet itself could not hold a steady position in space. From a distance, Earth might have appeared complete, a formed world with oceans, land, and atmosphere. But beneath that appearance it remained unfinished. Nothing had settled into permanence. Every system was still adjusting, still searching for balance, still responding to forces that had not yet been stabilized. And within this shifting world, a quiet question begins to form. If everything is in motion, if nothing repeats, if no pattern can be trusted, then what becomes of life? Can it begin in such uncertainty, or does it require something more, a foundation that remains steady long enough for growth to take hold? The answer does not reveal itself immediately. Instead, the planet continues in its restless state, shaped by forces both visible and hidden, moving through time without pause. Yet, within this motion, the possibility of stability still exists, waiting for something that has not yet arrived. For now, the Earth remains a world under construction, its future undecided, its systems incomplete. And as it turns beneath its heavy sky, the question lingers quietly, almost unnoticed, yet impossible to ignore. If life is to emerge, it must do so not in calm, but in chaos, learning to exist in a world that has not yet learned how to remain still. Life began quietly, almost unnoticed, in the shifting waters of an uncertain world. There was no sudden moment that marked its arrival, no clear beginning that separated lifeless Earth from a living one. Instead, it emerged gradually, in hidden places where conditions briefly aligned. Within the oceans, simple forms took shape, microscopic, fragile, and easily overlooked. They did not appear in a stable environment, but in one that changed constantly around them, as if the planet itself had not yet decided whether life should be allowed to remain. The waters that held these early organisms were never entirely consistent. Temperatures shifted over time, sometimes gently, sometimes more noticeably, depending on the atmosphere above and the movement of the planet itself. The chemistry of the oceans also changed, influenced by volcanic activity, by minerals dissolving into the water, by interactions that unfolded far beyond the reach of anything living. Sunlight filtered through the thick sky in uneven ways, sometimes dim, sometimes slightly brighter, never fully predictable. And yet, within this uncertainty, life persisted. It did not grow quickly. It did not expand across the planet in any dramatic way. Instead, it held on. Each organism existed at the edge of what was possible, surviving moment by moment, adapting in small ways to conditions that never remained the same for long. There was no steady path forward, no reliable pattern that could guide development. Every change required adjustment, and every adjustment came with risk. Over long stretches of time, these small forms began to change. Though slowly and cautiously, evolution was present, but it did not move with confidence. It felt restrained, as if something beyond the organisms themselves was limiting how far they could go. Life experimented, but only within narrow boundaries. Complexity did not emerge easily. Growth remained subtle, almost hesitant. There is a quiet tension in this moment of Earth's history, one that does not come from danger, but from possibility held just out of reach. Life has begun, and yet it cannot fully advance. It exists, but it does not flourish. It adapts, but it does not expand into something more complex or visible. The conditions that would allow such progress seem close, yet never quite stable enough to support it. It becomes increasingly clear that the limitation does not come from life itself. The organisms are capable of change, capable of adapting, capable of surviving even in difficult conditions. The restriction lies elsewhere, in the environment that surrounds them. The planet, still unsettled in its movements, still shifting in its patterns, does not yet provide the consistency that evolution requires to move forward with certainty, and so life remains suspended in this delicate state, neither failing nor fully succeeding. It continues, quietly, patiently, existing within a world that is not yet ready for what it could become. The oceans carry these early forms through time, holding them in an environment that offers just enough stability for survival, but not enough for transformation. It is easy to imagine that once life begins, it naturally progresses toward greater complexity, that it unfolds step by step into the diversity we see today. But this moment suggests something different. Progress is not guaranteed. It depends on conditions that must first be established, on a foundation that does not yet exist. The planet, in its current state, is holding life in place, and beneath this realization, another question begins to take shape, quiet but persistent. If the Earth itself cannot provide what is needed, then where will that change come from? The answer does not lie within the oceans, nor within the atmosphere, nor within the shifting crust below. It lies beyond, in something not yet part of this world, something still distant, still approaching. For now, life waits, continuing its careful existence as the planet turns through its unstable cycles. It does not know what is missing, only that something is. And as time moves forward, that absence begins to matter more with each passing age, shaping a future that has not yet arrived, but cannot be avoided. Far beyond Earth's horizon, beyond the dim veil of its early sky, something was already moving. It did not announce itself. It did not rush. It simply existed, following a path that had been set long before the planet below had begun to settle into its restless cycles. In the quiet expanse of the young solar system, where countless fragments still drifted and circled, this object travelled with a steady, unhurried motion. It was not yet part of Earth's story, and yet in time it would become one of its defining chapters. This traveller, later called Thea, was not small. It was a world of its own, shaped from the same cosmic material that had formed Earth itself. It moved through space with a quiet presence, neither drawn toward Earth by intention, nor avoiding it by design. Its path was simply the result of forces acting over immense distances, guiding it along a course that slowly and almost imperceptibly began to align with the orbit of the young planet. From the perspective of Earth, nothing seemed to change. The skies remained heavy, the surface continued its slow transformations, and life persisted in its fragile state within the oceans. There was no sign that anything beyond the atmosphere was approaching. And yet across the vast distance, Thea continued forward, its motion so gradual that even over thousands of years it would have seemed almost still. In the early solar system, such encounters were not impossible. The space around the sun was still filled with remnants of formation, objects moving along paths that occasionally crossed. But what makes this moment different is not the rarity of movement, but the consequence it would eventually bring. At this stage, there is no danger, no sudden shift in the balance of the planet, only the quiet approach of something that has not yet made its presence known. There is a strange calm in this part of the story, the kind of calm that exists before change becomes visible. Thea moves through darkness, reflecting faint light, its surface silent, its journey uninterrupted. It does not know where it is going in any meaningful sense. It does not aim, does not adjust, does not anticipate, and yet its path continues to narrow the distance between itself and Earth-time. In this moment, stretches beyond anything familiar. Millions of years pass as both bodies continue their separate motions, orbiting the sun, shifting slightly with each cycle. The gap between them closes not in a single moment, but through countless small adjustments, each one bringing them closer together without either being aware of the other. It is tempting to think of such an encounter as sudden as something that arrives without warning. But the truth is quieter. The event that will one day reshape Earth is already in motion, long before it can be observed. It is not a surprise. It is a process unfolding slowly, patiently, with a kind of inevitability that does not require urgency. And beneath this slow convergence lies a deeper realization. The instability of Earth, the wandering of its axis, the uncertain rhythms of its environment, none of these will resolve on their own. The planet, left to itself, would continue in its restless state, unable to find the balance it has not yet discovered. The change it requires does not exist within it. It is coming from elsewhere. Thea continues its approach silent and steady, carrying with it the potential to alter everything, though. Nothing in its motion suggests intention. It is simply following its path, guided by forces too large to perceive, moving closer with each passing age. And as the distance narrows further, the story begins to shift. What was once distant becomes relevant. What was once separate begins to connect. The quiet observation of a moving object gives way to something more significant, something that will soon move beyond possibility into consequence. The Earth does not yet know what is approaching. It continues to turn beneath its unstable sky, unchanged, unaware. But the path has already been set, and the moment, though still far away, is no longer avoidable. There was no moment of warning, no signal that marked the instant when distance finally disappeared. For ages, the two worlds had moved closer in silence, their paths narrowing until separation could no longer be maintained. And then, without urgency, without sound, the encounter began. Thea did not strike Earth as a sudden blow, but as a slow glancing collision, unfolding across time in a way that would have seemed almost suspended, as if the universe itself had paused to observe the universe itself, had paused above what was about to happen. The first contact did not shatter the planet. Instead, it pressed into it, merging motion with resistance. The surfaces met not with a sharp impact, but with an immense transfer of energy that spread outward in waves too vast to imagine. Rock did not behave as solid ground. It softened, flowed, and rose, responding to heat and pressure beyond anything the planet had experienced before. Entire regions of Earth's outer layers were lifted, stretched, and displaced, while Thea itself began to lose its form, dissolving into the larger body it had encountered. What followed was not destruction in the way it is often imagined. It was transformation. Material from both worlds surged upward, escaping the pull of the planet, carried into space in vast arcs of glowing debris. This was not a single explosion, but a continuous release, as if the surface of Earth had opened and allowed part of itself to drift outward. The sky, if it could have been seen through the chaos, would have filled with streams of molten rock, each fragment carrying the memory of the collision. The planet itself changed in that moment, though not in a way that could be immediately recognized. Its rotation shifted, altered by the transfer of momentum. The axis around which it turned adjusted, no longer wandering in the same uncertain pattern as before. Deep within, the structure of the planet was reshaped, layers mixing, heat redistributing, creating a new internal balance that would influence everything that followed. And yet, there was a strange calm within this immense event. The scale was beyond violence as it is usually understood. There were no sudden endings, no instant silence. Instead, there was motion, continuous and unfolding, as the energy of the collision spread outward and began to settle into new forms. Thea, once a separate world, no longer existed as it had before. It had become part of Earth, its material blending, its identity dissolving into something larger. Around the planet, the debris did not drift away into emptiness. It remained caught within Earth's gravitational reach, forming a vast glowing ring that circled the planet. This ring, made of fragments from both bodies, moved in a shared orbit, each piece following its own path, while remaining part of a greater structure. It was not yet stable, not yet settled, but it held together, suspended between dispersal and formation. There is a quiet realization hidden within this moment. The most violent event in Earth's history did not end the planet's story. It did not erase what had come before. Instead, it began something new. The instability that had defined Earth for so long was not removed in an instant, but it was changed, redirected, shaped into a different kind of motion. The collision did not create calm, but it set the conditions for it to emerge. It is easy to imagine that such an encounter would leave only destruction behind, that nothing stable could follow such immense change. But this moment suggests something else. Within chaos, there can be structure. Within disruption, there can be direction. The energy released did not vanish. It reorganized, carrying the planet toward a state it had not yet reached. As time continues forward, the glowing ring remains slowly evolving, its fragments interacting, colliding, and drawing closer together. What was once scattered begins to gather. What was once separate begins to unify. The process is slow, almost imperceptible, yet constant. And within that quiet movement, something begins to take shape, something that was not present before, something that will soon become impossible to ignore. The ring of debris did not remain a ring forever. What had been scattered in the aftermath of the collision began slowly and quietly to gather. Each fragment moved along its path, drawn not only by Earth below, but by the presence of other fragments nearby. Over time their motions aligned. Small pieces met and stayed together. Larger masses formed, then drew in more material, growing not through sudden events, but through steady accumulation. There was no single moment when the moon appeared. Its formation was gradual, almost gentle, as if the chaos that created it had been replaced by a quiet determination to become something whole. The glowing fragments cooled as they circled, their surfaces hardening, their shapes becoming more defined. What had once been a cloud of motion began to take on a sense of direction. As this new body formed, its presence introduced something Earth had never known. It was no longer alone. A companion now circled the planet, close enough to exert influence, distant enough to remain separate. This relationship did not announce itself in dramatic ways. It began subtly, through forces that could not be seen, only felt over time. The moon's gravity reached toward Earth, interacting with the oceans first. Waters that once moved without clear pattern began to respond. The rise and fall of tides became more pronounced, more regular, as if the oceans had found a rhythm they could follow. Coastlines experienced a steady pulse, a repeating motion that returned again and again, shaping the boundary between land and sea in ways that had not been possible before. But the influence extended beyond the oceans. The presence of the moon began to affect the very motion of the planet itself. Earth's axis, which had once wandered over long periods of time, started to settle. The constant shifting slowed, held within a narrower range. The tilt no longer drifted as freely as it had before. This change did not happen all at once. It unfolded gradually, over immense spans of time, as the gravitational interaction between Earth and its new companion created a stabilizing effect. With this stabilization came something entirely new: consistency. The distribution of sunlight across the planet began to follow more predictable patterns. Regions experienced changes that repeated rather than shifting endlessly. The early forms of seasons, still subtle, began to emerge not as random variations, but as cycles that could be relied upon. There is a quiet realization in this moment that is easy to overlook. The moon, which now appears so familiar in the night sky, was not always part of Earth's story. Its presence is not a simple feature of the planet, but the result of a rare and complex process. And yet, without it, the Earth would have remained in its earlier state, uncertain, unstable, unable to support the kind of development that would later define it. The most remarkable aspect of this transformation is how little it reveals on the surface. There is no visible signal that the planet has become more stable. No clear marker that announces the shift from chaos to balance. The changes occur quietly within the motion of the oceans, within the tilt of the planet, within patterns that unfold slowly enough to feel natural once they are established. The moon does not dominate the sky. It does not alter the world through sudden force. Instead, it works through persistence, through repetition, influence that builds over time. It becomes a silent guardian, shaping the conditions of the planet without drawing attention to itself. And as this new relationship settles into place, the Earth begins to change in ways that extend far beyond what can be immediately seen. The rhythms introduced by the moon create a foundation upon which new processes can develop. Stability, once absent, begins to take hold, not as a fixed state, but as a balance maintained through constant interaction. The story now moves forward into this new phase, where the presence of the moon continues to shape the planet in subtle but profound ways. What was once a world without rhythm is becoming something different, something capable of sustaining patterns that life can follow. And within those patterns, new possibilities begin to emerge quietly, patiently, waiting to unfold. For the first time in its long and uncertain history, Earth began to settle into something it had never truly known before. Not stillness, not perfection, but a quiet form of consistency. The wandering motion that had once defined the planet's behavior started to slow, guided gently by the presence now circling above it. The moon did not force this change, though. It did not correct the planet in a single moment. Instead, it influenced Earth gradually, shaping its motion through an interaction so subtle that no single moment could ever be identified as the turning point. The axis of the planet, once drifting across wide ranges over immense spans of time, began to hold within narrower limits. The tilt did not disappear. It remained, but it became steadier, less uncertain. This small adjustment carried consequences far greater than it appeared. With a more stable tilt, the way sunlight reached the surface of the planet began to follow patterns that could repeat. Before, warmth and cold had arrived without clear rhythm, shifting as the planet's orientation changed unpredictably. Now, a different kind of order began to form. Regions that leaned toward the sun experienced warmth, and as the planet continued its orbit, they slowly turned away, allowing cooler conditions to follow. This cycle did not happen perfectly at first. It took time for the pattern to establish itself, for repetition to replace randomness. Over countless cycles, something new emerged. The beginnings of seasons appeared, not as sharp divisions, but as gradual transitions that returned again and again. What had once been uncertain became familiar. Cold followed warmth, and warmth followed cold, not by chance but by a repeating motion that the planet could now maintain. There is a quiet shift in understanding that unfolds here. Stability does not arrive as an event. It is not something that suddenly replaces chaos. It is built slowly through small adjustments that accumulate over time. Each orbit, each rotation, each interaction between Earth and its companion contributes to a pattern that strengthens with repetition. The surface of the planet begins to reflect this change. Climates that once shifted unpredictably now hold within ranges that allow conditions to persist. Regions experience variation, but not complete transformation. The extremes that once dominated begin to soften, replaced by cycles that, while still dynamic, remain within limits that life can begin to recognize. And beneath this visible change lies something even more significant. The stabilization of the planet's tilt does not only affect seasons, it influences the entire climate system. Air currents, ocean temperatures, the distribution of energy across the planet all begin to align with this new consistency. The Earth, once unsettled in its behavior, starts to function as a connected system, where patterns in one part influence patterns in another. It is easy to overlook how profound this transformation is because it unfolds without spectacle. There are no sudden shifts, no dramatic signals, only the gradual replacement of unpredictability with repetition. Yet within that repetition lies the foundation for everything that will follow. The planet, in a sense, begins to remember. Not in the way living beings remember, but through the persistence of patterns. What happens once is more likely to happen again. And with each repetition, the pattern becomes stronger, more reliable, more deeply embedded in the behavior of the world. This is the moment when Earth begins to move from uncertainty toward balance. Not perfect balance, not permanent stability, but a state where change follows recognizable paths. It is a quiet transformation, but one that reshapes the possibilities for everything that exists on the planet. And as this new rhythm settles into place, another begins to rise alongside it. Not in the sky, not in the tilt of the planet, but in the movement of water across its surface. The oceans, influenced by the same presence that steadied the axis, begin to respond in ways they never had before. Their motion, once irregular, starts to follow a pattern of its own, one that will carry its influence far beyond the edges of the sea. The oceans, once restless yet without direction, began to change in a way that was almost impossible to notice at first. Their movements had always been present, shaped by distant forces and shifting conditions. But now something new was guiding them. The moon, newly formed and steadily circling the planet, reached out through gravity, gently pulling at the vast bodies of water that covered much of Earth's surface. This pull did not create sudden waves or violent surges. Instead, it introduced a rhythm. For the first time, the oceans began to rise and fall in a pattern that repeated. Water gathered slightly toward the moon, then receded, only to return again. This motion spread across the planet, creating cycles that unfolded with quiet consistency. It was as if the oceans had begun to breathe, expanding and contracting along the edges of the land, following a rhythm that no longer depended on chance. Along coastlines, this new movement reshaped the boundary between land and sea. Areas that were once permanently submerged were now exposed for a time, revealing surfaces that had not interacted with the open air before. Then, as the waters returned, those same areas were covered again. This repeated exchange created a shifting environment, one that was neither fully land nor fully ocean, but something in between. Within these zones, the world became more active. Minerals that had been locked within the ground were exposed, dissolved, and carried back into the water. Nutrients moved more freely, mixing in ways that had not been possible when the oceans were more static. The interaction between water, rock, and air created new conditions, subtle yet significant, allowing processes to unfold that required both exposure and immersion. Small pools formed in low-lying areas as the tides withdrew, holding water for a time before it either evaporated or was reclaimed by the returning sea. These pools experienced cycles of change, warming under the filtered sunlight, cooling as night returned, concentrating minerals as water levels shifted. Each cycle repeated, not perfectly, but with enough consistency to create patterns that could be relied upon. There is a quiet transformation taking place within these movements. The oceans are no longer just vast, passive bodies. They have become dynamic systems, interacting with the land, shaping environments that exist only because of this steady rhythm. What was once a relatively uniform expanse has become varied, filled with zones that change over time yet follow a predictable sequence. The significance of this shift extends beyond the movement of water itself. These tidal cycles introduce repetition into the environment in a way that had not existed before. Wet becomes dry, and dry becomes wet. Light gives way to darkness, and darkness returns to light. These transitions occur not randomly, but in a pattern that can be experienced again and again. For early life, this repetition offers something that had been missing. It creates conditions that can be anticipated, even if only in the simplest sense. Processes that depend on change can now align with these cycles. Growth, energy use, and adaptation begin to respond not only to the environment, but to the timing within it. The oceans, in this sense, do not just move. They begin to communicate a pattern to everything within them and along their edges. They provide a rhythm that can be followed, a sequence that can be adapted to. It is not imposed suddenly, but introduced gently, becoming more established with each passing cycle. What was once a world of shifting uncertainty is now beginning to organize itself into repeating motions. The boundary between land and water becomes a place of interaction rather than separation. The environment becomes more than a backdrop. It becomes a system of cycles that influence what can exist within it. And within this steady movement, a new possibility begins to take shape. Life, which had once existed within narrow limits, now encounters conditions that offer more than survival. The repeating nature of these environments provides a framework within which change can occur more effectively. As the tides continue their quiet rise and fall, the stage is set for something deeper to emerge. The rhythms of the oceans begin to extend their influence beyond the water itself, reaching into the processes of life, shaping how it grows, adapts, and evolves within this newly ordered world. Life had already learned how to endure, but now it began to learn something more subtle. It began to recognize repetition. Not consciously, not with intention, but through countless small adjustments that slowly aligned with the rhythms shaping the world around it. The rising and falling tides, the steady return of light and darkness, the gradual shifts in temperature. These patterns did not force life to change, but they offered something it had never fully experienced before. They offered consistency. In the shallow edges of the oceans where water met land and then returned again, microorganisms were exposed to cycles that repeated with quiet reliability. They experienced periods of immersion followed by brief exposure, moments of warmth followed by cooling, changes that occurred not randomly, but in a sequence that could be encountered again and again. Within these cycles, something began to take shape. Biological processes, once scattered and reactive, started to align with the timing of the environment. Feeding occurred when conditions were most favorable. Growth followed periods where energy could be gathered more effectively. Even the simplest forms of reproduction began to coincide with moments when survival was more likely. These were not decisions, but responses shaped over time, guided by repetition rather than chance. The change was not dramatic. There was no sudden appearance of complexity, no immediate leap toward advanced forms. Instead, there was a gradual refinement, a quiet organization of life around patterns that held steady long enough to be used. Evolution continued, but it did so with a new kind of direction, influenced not only by the ability to survive, but by the ability to match the rhythm of the planet. This shift carries a deeper meaning that is easy to overlook. It suggests that progress does not come solely from struggle or competition. It does not arise only from pressure or conflict. It also depends on stability, on the presence of conditions that remain consistent long enough for change to build upon itself. Without repetition, adaptation remains limited. Without predictability, growth cannot extend beyond simple survival. As these patterns became more established, life began to expand its possibilities. Structures that required coordination could now form because the environment provided a framework within which coordination could succeed. Processes that depended on timing could develop because the cycles they relied upon were no longer unpredictable. Complexity, in its earliest form, did not emerge because life became stronger. It emerged because the world became reliable enough to support it. This realization changes the way the story of life is understood. It is not only a story of resilience or competition, it is also a story of alignment, of life gradually matching itself to the rhythms of a planet that had finally begun to settle. The environment, once a source of constant disruption, became a partner in development, providing the consistency needed for new forms to take shape. The oceans, with their steady tides, and the planet, with its stabilizing tilt, created a system where repetition could guide change. Life responded, not all at once, but through countless small adjustments that accumulated over time. Each cycle reinforced the next, each pattern strengthening the possibility of further development, and within this alignment, something larger begins to unfold. The influence of these rhythms does not remain confined to the behavior of organisms. It extends outward, shaping the chemistry of the oceans, influencing the atmosphere, and grappling spant, forming the entire planet into a system that supports more than just survival. What began as a subtle adjustment between life and environment now moves toward a broader transformation, one that will reach beyond individual organisms and into the structure of the world itself. The sky above the early Earth did not change in a way that could be seen, yet it was never the same again. For long stretches of time, it remained dim and heavy, filled with gases that softened the light of the sun and held the warmth of the planet close. Nothing in its appearance suggested that a transformation was underway. There were no sudden shifts in colour, no clear signals that something new was forming within it. And yet far below, within the shallow waters where life had begun to find its rhythm, a process was quietly unfolding that would reach far beyond the oceans. Among the simplest organisms, a new way of interacting with the environment began to emerge. These early forms of life, small and easily overlooked, started to capture light in a way that allowed them to produce energy more efficiently. In doing so, they released a substance that had not previously existed in meaningful amounts within the atmosphere. Oxygen, though present in trace forms before, began to be produced continuously. At first, this change had no visible effect on the sky. The oxygen did not accumulate in the air. Instead, it reacted immediately with the world around it. In the oceans, it bonded with dissolved elements, altering the chemistry of the water in subtle ways. In the crust, it combined with minerals, slowly transforming the composition of the planet's surface. Each molecule of oxygen released was quickly used, disappearing into reactions that left no trace in the air above. This phase continued for immense spans of time. Oxygen was created, then consumed, over and over again, as if the planet itself was absorbing it before it could become part of the atmosphere. From a distance, nothing seemed to change. The sky remained as it had been, and the world continued its slow evolution without any clear indication that a new force was at work. But beneath this quiet repetition, a threshold was approaching. The processes that absorbed oxygen could not continue indefinitely. As more of it was produced, the available elements that could react with it began to diminish. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the balance shifted. Not all of the oxygen released was immediately consumed. Small amounts began to remain, lingering in the atmosphere. The change was subtle beyond measure. There was no moment when the sky suddenly transformed. Instead, the composition of the air shifted molecule by molecule over timescales so vast that no single generation of life could have perceived it. The atmosphere, once dominated by other gases, began to include this new element in increasing amounts. This quiet accumulation carried consequences, far greater than its subtle appearance suggested. Oxygen is not simply another component of the atmosphere. It is highly reactive, capable of altering the chemistry of the environment in profound ways. As its presence increased, it began to influence processes across the planet, from the surface of the oceans to the layers of the air itself. The Earth, without announcing it, was becoming something different from what it had been before. Its atmosphere, once stable in its composition, was now changing in a way that would affect everything that existed within it. The transformation was not visible, but it was real, unfolding steadily, guided by the activity of life itself. There is a quiet paradox in this moment. The smallest forms of life, operating without awareness, were reshaping the entire planet. Their actions, repeated countless times, were altering the conditions of the world in ways that would eventually allow for greater complexity. The environment was no longer just influencing life. Life was beginning to influence the environment. And as oxygen continued to accumulate, reaching levels that had never existed before, the consequences of this change began to extend beyond the atmosphere. The presence of this new element would not remain neutral. It would interact with life itself, creating effects that were both transformative and disruptive. The sky, still appearing unchanged, held within it the beginning of a shift that would redefine the relationship between life and the planet. What had started as a quiet process in the oceans was now becoming a force that would shape the future in ways no organism could yet anticipate. The sky did not darken, and the oceans did not boil, yet a profound change was moving through the world with quiet certainty. Oxygen, once absent in meaningful amounts, was no longer disappearing as quickly as it was created. It lingered, accumulated, and slowly became part of the environment that surrounded every living thing. What had begun as a subtle shift now carried consequences that reached into the very foundation of life itself. For many of the earliest organisms, this new element was not a gift, it was a threat. Their existence had been shaped in a world where oxygen played no role, where chemical processes unfolded without its presence. The sudden appearance of this reactive substance introduced conditions they were not built to endure. Oxygen interacted with their structures in ways that disrupted their stability, interfering with processes that had once allowed them to survive. The change did not arrive as a sudden catastrophe. There was no single moment when life vanished. Instead, it unfolded gradually as oxygen levels rose over long periods of time. Environments that had once supported vast populations became less hospitable. Some organisms retreated into places where oxygen remained scarce, hidden in deeper waters or isolated regions. Others did not adapt. They faded, slowly their presence diminishing as conditions shifted beyond what they could tolerate. This was not a violent extinction, but a quiet replacement. The world did not become empty. It changed. As some forms of life declined, others began to emerge, shaped by the very element that had disrupted those before them. These new organisms did not merely tolerate oxygen, they used it. The ability to interact with oxygen in a controlled way opened possibilities that had not existed before. Energy could be produced more efficiently, supporting processes that required greater complexity. Structures could develop that depended on a higher and more reliable energy supply. Life, which had once operated within narrow limits, now had access to new pathways for growth and adaptation. There is a profound contradiction at the heart of this moment. The same element that caused the decline of earlier life forms became the foundation for new ones. What appeared destructive was also transformative. The crisis did not end the story of life. It redirected it. As oxygen continued to accumulate, its influence extended further. It altered not only the organisms that could survive, but the environments themselves. Chemical reactions in the oceans changed, affecting the availability of nutrients. The atmosphere began to support new interactions, setting the stage for processes that would not have been possible before. Life responded to these changes in ways that were not immediate, but gradual and persistent. Organisms capable of using oxygen began to spread, occupying spaces left behind by those that could not adapt. Over time, they became more common, shaping ecosystems that were fundamentally different from those that had existed before. The world was not becoming more stable in the sense of remaining unchanged. It was becoming more capable of supporting complexity. The presence of oxygen allowed for interactions that required consistency and energy, creating conditions where new forms of life could develop structures and behaviors that had once been impossible. What makes this moment remarkable is not only the transformation itself, but the way it unfolds. There is no clear boundary between before and after. The change moves through time quietly, reshaping the balance of life without drawing attention to itself. Yet its impact is profound, reaching into every part of the planet. The crisis in this sense is also a beginning. It marks the transition from a world dominated by simple forms of life to one that can support greater diversity and complexity. The limitations that once held life in place begin to loosen, replaced by new possibilities that extend beyond what had been previously achievable. And as this new balance takes shape, another shift begins to emerge, one that will carry life even further. The conditions created by oxygen do not simply stabilize the world. They prepare it for something more intricate, more structured, more capable of sustaining the forms of life that will eventually define the planet. The story moves forward from this quiet turning point, where what once seemed like an ending reveals itself as the foundation of a new beginning. By now, the changes that once seemed isolated begin to align, revealing a pattern that could not be seen before. The stabilization of Earth's tilt, the steady rhythm of the tides, and the quiet rise of oxygen in the atmosphere were not separate events. They were connected, each one influencing the others, each one contributing to a world that was slowly becoming capable of something new. The planet no longer existed in the same uncertain state it once had. Its climates, though still dynamic, now followed patterns that repeated over time. The oceans moved with a rhythm that shaped the edges of continents and created environments where change occurred in cycles rather than unpredictably. The atmosphere, altered by the presence of oxygen, supported processes that required more energy than had previously been available. Together, these conditions formed a foundation that had never existed before. Life, which had once been limited by instability, began to respond to this new consistency. Cells, once operating as simple and independent units, started to interact in more organized ways. Some began to specialize, performing specific functions that supported others. This cooperation allowed for structures that were more complex than any single cell could achieve on its own. The emergence of multicellular organisms did not happen suddenly. It unfolded gradually through countless small steps, each one building upon the stability of the environment. Cells grouped together, forming simple assemblies, then more structured forms. Over time, these arrangements became more efficient, more coordinated, allowing for new possibilities in growth and survival. This shift marked a profound change in the nature of life. It was no longer limited to isolated existence. It began to operate as systems, where different parts worked together to create something larger. These early forms of complexity were still simple compared to what would come later, but they represented a new direction, one that would continue to develop over time. Ecosystems, too, began to grow more intricate. The interactions between organisms became more varied, as different forms of life occupied different roles within their environments. Some produced energy, others consumed it, and still others contributed to the recycling of materials. These relationships formed networks that connected life in ways that had not existed before. What becomes clear in this moment is that complexity is not the result of a single change. It emerges when multiple conditions align, when stability allows processes to build upon one another without being disrupted. The planet, through its gradual transformations, had reached a point where such alignment was possible. The moon, though distant and silent, had played a role in this transformation. Its influence on the planet's motion and the movement of the oceans had introduced rhythms that life could follow. These rhythms, combined with the changes in the atmosphere and the stabilization of climate, created an environment where complexity could take hold. It is easy to imagine that life simply evolves toward greater complexity as time passes. But this moment suggests something different. Complexity requires readiness. It depends on conditions that must be established before it can emerge. Without stability, without repetition, without the right balance of energy and environment, such development remains out of reach. Now, for the first time, the world is ready. Life begins to explore possibilities that had once been impossible. Structures become more defined, interactions more intricate, systems more connected. The planet itself supports these changes, providing the consistency needed for them to continue. And as this new phase unfolds, the relationship between life and the planet begins to shift once more. No longer is life simply adapting to its environment. It begins, in subtle ways, to influence it. The presence of living systems starts to shape the conditions around them, creating feedback loops that will carry this transformation even further. The story moves forward into this next stage, where the growing complexity of life begins to leave its own mark on the world, continuing the process that has been unfolding since the moment the planet first began to change. For most of Earth's early history, life had been shaped by the planet. It adapted, adjusted, and survived within conditions it could not control. The oceans, the atmosphere, the shifting surface, all of these determined what life could become. But now, something subtle began to change. The relationship was no longer one-sided. Life, still small and often invisible, began to influence the world around it. This shift did not happen suddenly. There was no moment when the planet changed direction. Instead, it unfolded quietly, through processes so gradual that they could only be understood over immense spans of time. In shallow waters, vast communities of microorganisms formed thin layers along surfaces, spreading across sediments and rocks. These microbial mats did not simply exist within their environment. They interacted with it. As they grew, they stabilized the surfaces beneath them. Sediments that would have been easily disturbed by currents or shifting tides began to hold together. Layers formed, slowly building structures that altered how water moved across them. These changes were small at first, but they accumulated, influencing the shape of the environment itself. At the same time, biological activity continued to affect the chemistry of the oceans. Organisms absorbed elements from the water, transformed them, and released new substances in return. These processes, repeated countless times, gradually changed the composition of the oceans. Nutrients became more organized, more available in certain areas, supporting further growth. The atmosphere, too, continued to respond. Oxygen levels, once only beginning to rise, were now maintained and influenced by the ongoing activity of life. The balance of gases in the air was no longer determined only by geological forces. It was shaped by living systems that interacted with the environment in continuous cycles. What emerges in this moment is a new kind of relationship. Earth is no longer just a place where life exists. It becomes a system in which life and environment influence each other, each shaping the other over time. The boundaries between cause and effect begin to blur. Changes in life alter the planet, and those changes in the planet, in turn, influence life. There is a quiet elegance in this feedback. Nothing happens instantly. No single organism transforms the world. Instead, countless small interactions, repeated over vast stretches of time, create shifts that become impossible to reverse. The planet begins to carry the imprint of life within its structure. Climate, once driven primarily by external and geological forces, now includes the influence of biological processes. The way energy moves through the atmosphere, the way elements cycle through oceans and land, all begin to reflect the presence of living system. These influences are not dominant at first, but they grow stronger with each passing age. For the first time, life is not only surviving within the world, it is participating in its formation. This realization changes the way the planet is understood. Earth is no longer a passive stage where events unfold independently of its inhabitants. It becomes active, dynamic, shaped in part by the organisms it supports. The presence of life introduces a level of interaction that extends across the entire system. And as this interaction deepens, another effect begins to emerge. The environment, now influenced by life, becomes more stable in certain ways. The feedback between biological processes and planetary systems creates conditions that can maintain balance over longer periods. Variations still occur, but they are moderated, shaped by the presence of life itself. The world, once defined by uncertainty, continues its movement toward consistency. And within that growing stability, new possibilities begin to take shape, waiting to be explored by the life that has already begun to transform it. There is a moment in the history of Earth that cannot be seen, cannot be pointed to, and yet changes everything. It is not marked by an explosion, a sudden shift, or a dramatic event. It is quieter than that. It is the moment when stability, once rare and uncertain, becomes something that can be expected. The most important change in Earth's history was not something that drew attention. It was the arrival of normal. For ages, the planet had moved through states of imbalance, adjusting to forces that never allowed it to settle. But now, through the combined influence of its own evolving systems and the steady presence of the Moon, Earth begins to maintain conditions that persist over time. Patterns do not disappear, but they no longer drift endlessly. They return. Climate, once shifting unpredictably, begins to follow long-term trends that remain within limits. Regions experience variation, but not complete transformation. Warmth and cold alternate in ways that are consistent enough to be anticipated. The extremes that once defined the planet begin to soften, replaced by ranges that allow environments to endure rather than constantly reset. The oceans, too, take on a new character. Their movement, shaped by tidal rhythms and internal circulation, begins to distribute nutrients more effectively across vast distances. Waters that were once isolated in their behavior become part of a larger system, connected through currents that move energy and material throughout the planet. This circulation supports life not just in one place, but across entire regions, allowing ecosystems to develop with greater continuity. Within these ecosystems, balance begins to emerge. Not a fixed balance, but one that adjusts over time, maintaining itself through interaction. Organisms influence each other, shaping populations, resources, and environments in ways that prevent any single force from dominating completely. Growth is followed by limitation, expansion by adjustment. The system does not remain still, but it remains within bounds. What makes this moment remarkable is how easily it can be overlooked. Stability feels ordinary. It does not demand attention because it does not disrupt. It allows things to continue, to develop, to build upon what already exists. And yet, this very quality is what makes it extraordinary. Without stability, life is confined to survival. It reacts, adapts, endures, but it cannot move far beyond its immediate condition. With stability, something else becomes. Life can begin to experiment. Organisms can explore variations that do not need to succeed immediately. They can develop structures and behaviors that depend on conditions remaining consistent long enough for those developments to take hold. Diversity begins to increase, not because of sudden change, but because the environment allows for gradual expansion into new possibilities. New niches emerge, spaces within ecosystems where different forms of life can exist without direct competition. These niches are created by the interactions between organisms and their environment, shaped by patterns that remain steady over time. Life begins to spread into these spaces, filling them with forms that reflect the stability of the world they inhabit. It becomes clear that this normal is not accidental. It is the result of countless interactions unfolding over immense spans of time. The moon's influence stabilizes the planet's motion. The oceans circulate energy and nutrients. Life itself contributes to the balance of the atmosphere and environment. Together, these elements create a system that sustains itself, not perfectly, but reliably. The planet, once defined by uncertainty, now carries a form of consistency that supports growth, diversity, and complexity. It is not a static state, but a dynamic one, maintained through continuous interaction. Stability is not the absence of change. It is the presence of patterns that allow change to occur without disrupting the whole. And within this stable world, life begins to move forward in new ways. It is no longer limited to quiet survival or small adjustments. It begins to expand, to diversify, to explore forms and structures that would not have been possible before. The story now shifts toward this new phase, where the presence of stability allows life to become more visible, more varied, and more intricate, shaping ecosystems that reflect the full potential of a world that has finally learned how to remain balanced. The world did not change all at once. There was no single moment when everything became different, no clear boundary between what had been and what would follow. Instead, the transformation unfolded quietly, built from countless small shifts that, over time, created something entirely new. The world we recognize today did not begin with a single event. It began with a change so subtle that nothing living at the time could have noticed it. Stability, once uncertain, had taken hold. The rhythms of the planet, its tilt, its tides, its climate, no longer drifted without pattern. They repeated, returned, and reinforced themselves. Life, which had once existed at the edge of possibility, now found itself within an environment that could support more than survival. It could support growth, expansion, and exploration. This change did not produce immediate results. Life did not suddenly become complex, nor did it fill the planet with new forms overnight. Instead, it began to move forward with a quiet confidence, guided by conditions that no longer shifted unpredictably. The foundations had been laid, and now slowly they began to support something greater. In the oceans, organisms continued to adapt, but their adaptations now built upon one another. Structures became more refined, interactions more coordinated. The simple systems that had once defined life began to give way to more intricate arrangements, where different parts worked together in ways that had not been possible before. Along the edges of land and sea, environments shaped by tides and cycles became places of opportunity. These transitional spaces where water and land met in repeating patterns offered conditions that encouraged experimentation. Life began to explore these boundaries, not in sudden leaps, but through gradual extension, testing what could be sustained beyond the stability of the oceans. There is a sense, in this moment, of something beginning without fully revealing itself. The changes are present, but they are not yet visible in the way they will be later. The world remains quiet, its transformations unfolding beneath the surface of perception, and yet everything that follows depends on what is happening here. It is easy to think of the present world as something that emerged through dramatic events, through moments that defined history in clear and visible. But this stage of Earth's story suggests something different. The most important changes are not always the ones that can be seen. They are the ones that create the conditions for everything else to occur. The planet, now stable in ways it had never been before, becomes a place where possibility can expand. Life is no longer constrained by constant disruption. It begins to occupy new spaces, to form new relationships, to develop in directions that were once impossible. There is no rush in this process. It unfolds at its own pace, guided by the rhythms that have taken shape over time. Each change builds upon those that came before, creating a continuity that carries the story forward without interruption. And within this continuity, the future begins to take form. Larger organisms will emerge, ecosystems will grow more complex, and life will extend into environments that have not yet been fully explored. But none of this happens in isolation. It all traces back to the quiet shift that allowed the planet to become stable, to hold patterns long enough for life to follow them. The world, as it exists now, is the result of that shift. As the story moves forward, the focus begins to expand, turning toward the ways in which life will begin to move beyond its current boundaries. The stable Earth becomes a foundation, not an end, and upon that foundation, life prepares to take its next steps, reaching into new environments and discovering what more it can become. For most of its long history, life remained within the oceans, held by the quiet stability of water. There, conditions were buffered, changes softened, and survival, though never guaranteed, followed patterns that could be endured. The sea provided a kind of protection, a consistent environment where life could exist without facing the full intensity of the world beyond. And yet, at the edges of this vast system, something new began to appear. Along the margins where water met land, the steady rhythm of the tides created places unlike any that had existed before. These were not fully ocean, nor fully land, but shifting boundaries that changed with each cycle. The water would rise, covering the surface, then withdraw, leaving it exposed. This repeated movement created environments that were both stable and changing at the same time. These coastal zones became thresholds, places where life encountered conditions it had never experienced before. Surfaces that had once remained hidden beneath the water were now revealed, exposed to air, to light, to a different kind of dryness. Then, as the tides returned, these same surfaces were submerged again, restoring the familiar conditions of the ocean. Within these shifting spaces, life began to respond. Microbial communities, already adapted to the rhythms of the tides, found themselves carried into these transitional environments. Some clung to surfaces as the water receded, remaining behind for short periods before the next cycle returned. These moments of exposure were brief, but they were repeated again and again, creating opportunities for small adjustments to take place. Life did not move onto land in a single moment. It did not surge forward or expand rapidly. Instead, it hesitated. It remained close to the water, testing the edges, enduring conditions that were unfamiliar but not entirely hostile. Each exposure brought new challenges: drying surfaces, direct sunlight, the absence of the surrounding water that had always supported and protected it. And yet, these challenges were not constant. The tides returned, restoring the conditions life knew how to survive. This repetition allowed for something that would not have been possible in a purely unstable environment. It allowed for experimentation. Over time, small changes accumulated. Organisms that could endure slightly longer periods of exposure persisted. Those that could anchor themselves more effectively to surfaces remained in place, as the water moved away and back again. These adaptations were subtle, unfolding over long spans of time, guided by the steady rhythm of the tides. There is a quiet significance in this moment that is easy to overlook. The movement of life toward land did not begin with a dramatic transition. It began with hesitation, with small steps taken at the edge of what was possible. The boundary between water and land was not crossed in a single act, but approached gradually, through repeated interactions with environments that existed only because of the planet's growing stability. Without the steady influence of the moon, these tidal zones would not have existed in a consistent form. The rise and fall of the oceans would not have created the same reliable patterns, and the opportunities for life to explore these boundaries would have been far more limited. The presence of rhythm made these experiments possible, and so life remained at the edge, extending itself just far enough to test what lay beyond, then retreating, then returning again. Each cycle carried the possibility of change, and over time, those possibilities began to shape a new direction. The journey had begun, though it was not yet visible in the way it would later become. Life was no longer confined entirely to the safety of the oceans. It had found the boundary, and it was learning slowly and carefully how to exist there. As this process continues, the challenges of this new environment begin to reveal themselves more clearly, shaping the adaptations that will determine whether life can move beyond the water's edge and into a world that has always existed, but has never before been truly inhabited. At the edge of the water, the world feels different in ways that are difficult to anticipate. What once seemed like a simple boundary reveals itself as a place of constant challenge. Life, having lingered in these transitional zones, begins to encounter conditions that cannot be ignored. The moment the water recedes, everything changes. Gravity, once softened by the support of water, becomes more present. Organisms that drifted or rested with ease now feel their own weight more fully. Structures that were sufficient within the ocean begin to strain under this new pressure. Movement becomes more difficult, and remaining in place requires new forms of support. The surface itself offers no stability. Unlike the fluid environment of the sea, land is uneven, shifting, and often dry. Without the constant presence of water, the risk of losing moisture becomes immediate. Surfaces that appear stable can change quickly, influenced by heat, exposure, and the absence of the buffering effect the ocean once provided. Sunlight, too, takes on a different quality. In the water, it was filtered, softened by depth and distance. Here, it reaches directly, carrying energy that can be both beneficial and harmful. Exposure becomes a factor that must be endured, not simply experienced. Organisms that remain too long risk damage, while those that retreat too quickly cannot take advantage of the conditions that might support their growth. And yet, life does not withdraw entirely. It continues to test these boundaries, returning again and again with each cycle of the tides. Each attempt brings new challenges, and many of those attempts do not succeed. Organisms are exposed for too long and fail to recover. Structures collapse under their own weight. Surfaces dry faster than they can adapt to. These failures do not end the process. They become part of it. Life did not conquer land. It learned slowly and carefully how to survive it. With each cycle, small variations appear. Some organisms retain moisture slightly more effectively, holding on to water just long enough to endure the period of exposure. Others develop ways to anchor themselves more securely, resisting the pull of receding tides and the instability of the surface beneath them. These changes are subtle, but they persist. The key to this process lies not in a single successful adaptation, but in repetition. The environment, shaped by the steady influence of the moon, provides cycles that return again and again. The tides withdraw, expose, and return with a consistency that allows these experiments to continue over immense stretches of time. Without this repetition, the process would remain incomplete. A single exposure would not be enough to shape adaptation. A single success would not be enough to sustain it. But the cycles continue, offering countless opportunities for life to adjust, refine, and build upon previous changes. There is a quiet persistence in this process. Life does not advance in a straight line. It moves forward through a series of attempts, each one influenced by what came before. Failures are not final. They contribute to the gradual refinement of forms that can endure slightly longer, function slightly better, adapt slightly more effectively. Over time, these small changes begin to accumulate. Organisms that once could only survive brief moments outside the water begin to remain for longer periods. The boundary between water and land becomes less and less absolute as life learns to occupy it more fully. This transition remains slow, almost imperceptible when viewed over short periods, but across vast spans of time, the direction becomes clear. Life is not turning back. It is continuing to explore, to adapt, to extend itself into an environment that once seemed entirely beyond its reach. And as these adaptations strengthen, something begins to shift. The presence of life on, once Splafekand, starts Pia, Hamasi, Kamar. The brief visits between tides begin to extend, hinting at a future where life no longer depends entirely on the return of the water. The struggle does not end here. It continues, shaping the forms that will eventually establish themselves beyond the edge of the ocean. But within this struggle lies the beginning of a new phase, one where life moves from testing the boundary to slowly becoming part of a world it had never before inhabited. There is no single moment when life steps onto land and remains. No clear boundary marks the instant when the ocean releases its hold. Instead, the change unfolds so quietly that it could be missed entirely, even as it begins to reshape the future of the planet. What was once temporary becomes slightly longer, and what was once uncertain begins to hold. At the edge of the tides, where water withdraws and returns in steady cycles, some forms of life no longer retreat completely. They remain anchored to surfaces that are exposed for longer periods than before. These organisms do not abandon the water all at once. They continue to depend on its return, but they are no longer entirely defined by it. Simple plant-like forms begin to spread across damp surfaces, drawing what they need from both water and air. They hold themselves in place, resisting the pull of the tides, enduring exposure with growing resilience. Their structures, though still delicate, are enough to maintain their position through repeated cycles. Each return of the water supports them, and each withdrawal tests them. The shift is subtle, but it carries a profound meaning. For the first time, life is not merely visiting land. It is beginning to remain. These early communities form thin layers across surfaces, connecting with one another in ways that create stability. They hold moisture longer, trap sediments, and alter the immediate environment around them. What was once a bare surface becomes a place where conditions are slightly more controlled, slightly more supportive of continued existence. This is not an invasion, it is a settling. Life does not rush forward or spread rapidly across the land. It establishes itself in small, scattered areas, building slowly, guided by the same patterns that made this transition possible. The steady rhythm of tides, the consistent cycles of light and temperature, all continue to support this gradual expansion. Over time, these small communities begin to form the earliest ecosystems on land. They are simple, fragile, and limited in scope, but they represent something entirely new. Life is no longer confined to the oceans. It exists in two realms, connected yet distinct, each influencing the other. The importance of this moment is not in its scale, but in its direction. The presence of life on land, even in its simplest form, opens possibilities that did not exist before. It creates the foundation upon which more complex systems can develop, though that complexity remains far in the future. What allows this to happen is not a sudden change in life itself, but the stability of the environment in which it exists. The planet, now capable of maintaining consistent conditions over long periods, provides the reliability needed for life to establish itself beyond the water. Without this consistency, the transition would remain incomplete, interrupted by changes too extreme to allow progress. The land, once a place of constant challenge, begins to hold conditions that can be endured. Not perfectly, not everywhere, but in enough places for life to take hold and remain. These first permanent steps are small, but they are steady, supported by the patterns that have emerged across the planet. And within these small beginnings, lies something much larger. The thin layers of life that now exist on land will, over time, give rise to more complex forms. The processes that begin here will continue to develop, leading eventually to forests, to animals, to entire ecosystems that will reshape the surface of the planet. But none of that is visible yet. For now, the world remains quiet, its transformation unfolding slowly. Life has taken its first steps onto land, not with force but with patience. It has begun to a place it had never known before, and as it settles into this new existence, another shap's formation begins to take shape, one that will extend beyond individual organisms and into the structure of planet itself, altering its surface and atmosphere in ways that will define the next chapter. At first, the land does not appear to change. Its surfaces remain exposed, shaped by wind, water and time, carrying the marks of a world that had long existed without life. The early forms that settled along its edges are small, quiet and easily overlooked, and yet something has begun that will not remain small for long. The land did not suddenly become green. It learned slowly how to support life. What began as thin layers of simple organisms gradually spreads across wider areas. These early plant-like forms anchor themselves to surfaces, drawing energy from sunlight and interacting with the air in ways that had not been possible before. They do not grow tall, nor do they cover vast distances at once. Instead, they extend outward, forming patches that connect and expand over time. As they spread, they begin to change the surfaces beneath them. Soils, once loose and easily disturbed, become more stable. Roots and structures hold particles together, reducing the constant shifting that once defined the land. Moisture is retained for longer periods, creating conditions that support continued growth. The environment begins to hold itself in place. This transformation unfolds gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. There is no moment when the land becomes fully alive. Instead, it changes in stages, each one building upon the last. Areas that were once bare begin to show signs of coverage. Patches of life grow larger, more connected, more persistent. With this spread comes another change, one that extends beyond the surface. These early plants interact with the atmosphere, continuing the process that began in the oceans. They capture sunlight and release oxygen, contributing to the gradual transformation of the air. This process, repeated across expanding areas of land, begins to influence the planet on a broader scale. The presence of plant life also creates new environments for other forms of life. Surfaces that were once exposed and uninhabitable now offer shelter, structure, and resources. The land, once a place of constant challenge, begins to support a wider range of organisms, each one interacting with the environment in its own way. What is emerging is not just a change in appearance, but a change in function. The land is no longer passive. It becomes active, shaped by the presence of life that interacts with it continuously. The cycles of growth, decay, and renewal begin to establish themselves, creating systems that sustain themselves over time. There is a quiet shift in perspective here. Life is no longer simply adapting to the planet. It is shaping it in visible ways. The surfaces of the Earth begin to reflect the presence of living systems, altering the way energy flows, the way materials move, the way environments develop. This transformation does not move quickly. It unfolds over vast spans of time, guided by the same stability that allowed life to reach land in the first place. Each cycle of growth strengthens the presence of life, allowing it to expand further, to establish itself more firmly. The world begins to change its appearance, though not all at once. The barren landscapes of the past give way to areas of coverage, then to wider regions where life holds its place. The process continues, steady and persistent, reshaping the surface of the planet in ways that will define its future. And within this new world, new opportunities begin to emerge. The presence of plant life creates the conditions needed for other organisms to follow to interact, to build upon what has already been established. The land, once empty, becomes a place of possibility. As this transformation continues, the story moves forward into the next phase, where life begins to expand beyond these early forms, filling the spaces created by this growing foundation and shaping a world that is becoming more complex with each passing age. Where plants take hold, the land changes in ways that are not immediately obvious, yet impossible to reverse. The surfaces they cover no longer remain empty or still. They begin to offer something new: energy, structure, and shelter. And where these conditions exist, life does not remain distant for long. First, the presence of other organisms is subtle. Small forms appear among the early vegetation, moving cautiously through an environment that is still unfamiliar. They do not arrive all at once, nor do they spread rapidly. Instead, they follow the conditions that have been created, entering spaces where survival has become possible in ways it was not before. The relationship is not accidental. Plants capture energy from sunlight, storing it in forms that can be used by other organisms. This stored energy becomes a foundation, supporting life that depends on consuming it. The land, once unable to provide such resources, now begins to sustain of interactions that extends beyond a single form of life. Some of the earliest animals move slowly across these surfaces, feeding on plant material or on other organisms that have gathered there. Their presence introduces movement into environments that were once defined by stillness. The land, which had only recently begun to support life, now begins to host activity. This expansion unfolds as a chain reaction. One form of life creates the conditions for another, which in turn supports yet another. Each step builds upon what came before, forming connections that link organisms together in ways that had not previously existed on land. The interactions between these forms begin to shape the environment further. As animals move, they disturb surfaces, redistribute materials, and influence the growth of plants. Feeding alters the balance of vegetation, creating variation in what grows and where. These changes, though small at first, contribute to the development of ecosystems that are more dynamic and interconnected. There is a growing sense of complexity in this process, but it does not arise from a single source. It emerges from relationships. No organism exists entirely on its own. Each one depends on others, directly or indirectly, forming networks that connect life across the land. What makes this expansion possible is not only the presence of resources, but the stability of the environment in which these interactions occur. The patterns established by the planet, its steady climate, its consistent cycles, allow these relationships to persist over time. Without this stability, the connections between organisms would remain fragile, easily disrupted before they could develop. Instead, they hold, they repeat, they strengthen. As these ecosystems grow, they begin to take on a structure of their own. Different organisms occupy different roles, contributing to the flow of energy and materials through the system. Some produce, others consume, and still others break down what remains, returning it to the environment where it can be used again. This organization is not planned. It arises naturally from the interactions between life and its surroundings. Yet it creates a balance that allows ecosystems to maintain themselves, even as they continue to change. The land, once a place of limited possibility, becomes filled with movement. Life no longer exists only in isolated patches. It spreads, connects, and interacts, creating environments that are alive in ways that go beyond simple presence. There is a quiet realization within this transformation. The expansion of life is not driven by isolated events, but by connections that build over time. Each new form depends on those that came before, creating a sequence that continues to extend outward. And as these connections deepen, new dynamics begin to emerge. The relationships between organisms become more complex, involving not only cooperation, but also competition. Balance becomes something that must be maintained through constant interaction. The story now moves into this deeper level of organization, where life does not simply exist and expand, but begins to regulate itself, shaping ecosystems that are both dynamic and stable, reflecting the full complexity of a world that has learned how to season life. At first, the growing presence of life on land appears chaotic. New forms spread, interactions multiply, and movement fills spaces that were once still. It might seem that such expansion would lead to instability, that the increasing complexity would overwhelm the systems that have only recently begun to form. And yet, something different begins to take shape. The world does not become stable by remaining unchanged. It becomes stable by adjusting constantly in response to itself. Within these developing ecosystems, relationships deepen. Organisms no longer exist simply alongside one another. They influence each other directly, shaping how populations grow, how resources are used, and how energy moves through the environment. Some forms of life consume others, introducing a new dynamic into the system. What once was a simple exchange of energy becomes a network of interactions that extends across entire ecosystems. Predators and prey begin to define parts of this structure. One organism depends on another for survival, while that same dependency places limits on how much either can expand. If one grows too numerous, it affects the balance of the other. If one declines, it creates space for the other to recover. These relationships do not remain fixed. They shift over time, responding to changes within the system itself. At the same time, processes of growth and decay become more integrated. As organisms live, they alter their environment. As they die, they return materials back to the system, making them available for new life. This cycle repeats continuously, connecting past and present within a flow that sustains the ecosystem as a whole. What emerges from these interactions is not a static balance, but a dynamic one. The system does not hold itself in a single state. It moves, adjusts, and responds. Yet it remains within limits that allow it to persist. Change is constant, but it does not lead to collapse. Instead, it becomes part of how stability is maintained. There is a deeper realization within this process. Stability is not the absence of movement. It is the presence of relationships that can absorb and respond to change. The ecosystems that now cover the land and oceans are not fragile in the way they once were. They are resilient, capable of adjusting to variations while continuing to function. This resilience extends beyond individual ecosystems. The planet itself begins to reflect this interconnected balance. Life influences the environment, and the environment shapes life in return. The atmosphere, the oceans, the land all become part of a system where changes in one area affect others, creating feedback that helps maintain overall stability. Earth, in this sense, becomes more than a collection of separate processes. It becomes a self-regulating system where countless interactions work together to sustain conditions that support life. This regulation is not controlled or directed. It arises naturally from the connections that have formed over time. What is remarkable about this transformation is how quietly it unfolds. There is no single moment when balance is achieved. It develops gradually through the accumulation of interactions that begin to align. Each relationship contributes to the whole, creating a system that is greater than the sum of its parts. And within this system, life continues to evolve, not in isolation, but as part of a network that supports and limits it at the same time. The balance that emerges is not perfect, nor is it permanent, but it is enough to allow the planet to sustain complexity over long periods. As this balance becomes established, the story begins to widen in scope. The focus shifts from individual ecosystems to the broader patterns that shape the future of life on Earth. The processes that have developed so far do not remain confined to the present moment. They set the stage for what will come next, influencing the direction of life as it continues to unfold across the planet. Once the world settled into patterns that could be trusted, something within life began to change. It did not become faster in the way movement becomes faster, nor did it suddenly transform in dramatic leaps. Instead, it began to build upon itself more efficiently. The processes that once unfolded slowly, limited by uncertainty, now found a path that could continue without interruption. Evolution had always been present, shaping life in small, careful steps. But now, with stability holding the environment within consistent bounds, those steps began to connect more easily. Changes did not have to start over each time conditions shifted. They could continue, extend, and combine with what had come before. Once the world became stable, life began to move forward faster than ever before. This acceleration is not sudden. It unfolds gradually, almost gently, as if the pace of change is increasing without drawing attention to itself. Over long spans of time, species begin to diversify. What was once a limited range of forms expands into a wider variety, each adapted to specific conditions within the environment. Ecosystems, already established, grow more intricate as new forms of life occupy the spaces created by existing ones. Each new organism introduces possibilities for further interactions, further adaptations, further development. The presence of one form allows another to emerge, creating layers of complexity that build upon one another. This growth is guided by the same patterns that now define the planet. The steady cycles of climate, the consistent movement of oceans, the reliable presence of energy from the sun all provide a framework within which life can continue to develop. Without these patterns, each change would remain isolated. With them, change becomes cumulative. There is a quiet sense of momentum in this process. Life is no longer confined to narrow paths of adaptation. It begins to explore a wider range of possibilities, testing forms and structures that were once beyond reach. Some of these changes persist, becoming part of the ongoing development of life. Others do not, fading as conditions favor different directions. The important shift is not in the speed of individual changes, but in the continuity between them. Evolution becomes a process that can build over time, rather than one that is constantly interrupted by instability. This continuity allows for greater complexity to emerge, as structures and systems develop that depend on long-term consistency. The world, once a place of limitation, becomes a place of opportunity. Life responds by expanding into new environments, refining existing forms and creating variations that reflect the diversity of conditions now available. The oceans, the land, and the spaces between them all become part of this expanding system, each supporting different aspects of life's development. What becomes clear in this moment is that complexity does not arise from chaos alone. It depends on a foundation that allows change to accumulate. Stability provides that foundation, enabling life to move beyond simple survival and into a state where growth can continue in a more sustained way. This does not mean that the world becomes static or unchanging. Variations still occur, and environments continue to shift within certain limits. But these changes no longer disrupt the overall process. They become part of it, influencing the direction of evolution without stopping its progress. As this acceleration continues, new forms of life begin to stand out more clearly. Organisms grow larger, structures become more defined, and interactions between species become more complex. The world begins to fill with forms that reflect the full potential of the conditions that have been established. The story now moves toward this next phase, where the increasing pace of evolution leads to the emergence of life that is not only more diverse, but also more visible, shaping environments in ways that will define the future of the planet. Complex life did not arrive as a sudden event. It did not appear fully formed or transform the world in a single moment. Instead, it emerged gradually shaped by the same patterns that had been guiding the planet for ages. The stability of the environment, the steady flow of energy, and the growing interconnectedness of ecosystems created conditions where new forms of life could take shape. These forms were different from what had come before. They were not simply collections of similar parts. They were organized, structured, composed of components that performed specific roles. Cells no longer functioned independently. They worked together, forming systems that allowed for greater coordination and efficiency. Structures began to develop that could support movement, sensing, and interaction with the environment in more refined ways. Organisms became capable of responding to their surroundings with greater precision. They could seek resources, avoid threats, and engage with other forms of life in ways that had not been possible before. This shift did not happen all at once. It unfolded over long periods, with each development building upon earlier forms. Some organisms developed simple internal systems that allowed them to process energy more effectively. Others evolved structures that provided support, enabling them to grow larger and maintain their shape outside of water. With these changes came new behaviors. Life was no longer limited to passive existence or simple responses. It began to move with intention, interacting with the environment in ways that reflected its growing complexity. Movement itself became a defining feature, allowing organisms to explore their surroundings rather than simply exist within them. There is a deeper realization within this transformation. Complexity is not defined only by size or intelligence. It is defined by relationships within the organism and between the organism and its environment. The structures that develop are not isolated. They function as part of a system, each component contributing to the whole. At the same time, these organisms exist within ecosystems that are themselves becoming more interconnected. The presence of complex creatures influences the balance of these systems. Predation, cooperation, and competition all play roles in shaping how life continues to evolve. Each interaction creates conditions that influence what can develop next. The environment, stable yet dynamic, supports this growing complexity. Without consistent conditions, such intricate structures could not persist. They depend on patterns that remain reliable over time, allowing systems within organisms to function without constant disruption. This is the moment when life begins to express the full potential of the foundation that has been established. The processes that once limited development have given way to possibilities that extend far beyond simple survival. Life begins to occupy roles that require coordination, adaptation, at levels that were once unimaginable. The world itself begins to reflect this change. Movement becomes more common, more visible. Interactions between organisms shape the environment in ways that continue to influence its development. The presence of complex creatures adds new layers to ecosystems, making them more dynamic and more capable of sustaining further growth. And yet, even at this stage, the process remains gradual. Complexity continues to build, extending into new forms and structures over time. The direction is clear, but the pace remains steady, guided by the same principles that have shaped the planet from the beginning. As this new phase unfolds, the story moves toward a deeper understanding of how these complex forms interact with each other and with the world around them. The presence of such creatures is not an end point. It is another step in a process that continues to evolve, shaping the future of life on Earth in ways that are only beginning to emerge. The world we see today is not the final chapter. It is only a moment, held briefly within a story that has never stopped unfolding. Everything that has come before, the instability of the early planet, the collision that reshaped it, the slow emergence of rhythm, the rise of life and its growing complexity, has not led to an ending. It has led to this moment, one point along a path that continues beyond anything we can fully see. The patterns that formed in those distant ages still remain. The Earth continues to turn with a steady tilt, guided by forces that were set into motion long ago. Oceans still rise and fall, following rhythms that began when the planet found its balance. The atmosphere, shaped by life over immense spans of time, still carries the imprint of those earliest changes. It is easy to think of the past as something separate, something distant and complete. But the story of Earth does not divide itself so clearly. The processes that shaped the world are still active, still influence the present in ways that come and go. The stability that allows life to exist today is not a permanent condition. It is something that is continuously maintained. The moon, silent and constant, remains part of this ongoing story. Its presence continues to influence the motion of the planet, the movement of the oceans, and the patterns that define the environment. What it began in the distant past has not ended. It continues, quietly shaping the conditions that allow life to persist. Life itself has not stopped evolving. It continues to adapt, to change, to respond to the environment and to each other. The complexity that has emerged is not fixed. It grows, shifts, and reorganizes, influenced by the same interactions that have always guided it. Each generation carries forward the changes that came before, adding new variations, new possibilities. There is a sense of continuity that becomes clear in this moment. The world is not built from isolated events, but from processes that extend through time, connecting past and present in ways that cannot be separated. The conditions that exist now are the result of everything that has happened before. just as the future will emerge from what exists now. This realization brings a different perspective. The story is not something that has been told and completed. It is something that is still being written, with each moment adding to what will come next. The patterns that have been established provide a foundation, but they do not limit what can develop. They allow for change, for growth, for new forms of life to emerge. The Earth, in this sense, is not a finished world. It is a living system constantly adjusting, constantly responding, constantly moving forward. The stability that defines it is not static. It is dynamic, maintained through interactions that continue without pause. And within this ongoing process, the present becomes part of the same story as the past. The world we experience is not separate from what came before. It is a continuation shaped by the same forces, guided by the same patterns, influenced by the same relationships. As the narrative moves toward its final chapters, the connection between past and present becomes even clearer. The changes that began in those distant ages are not only part of history. They are part of the world as it exists now, influencing everything that continues to unfold. The story does not end here. It continues, quietly carried forward by the same processes that have shaped the planet from the beginning, extending into a future that remains open, shaped by forces both seen and unseen, just as it has always been. The moon hangs in the sky as something familiar, something easily overlooked. It rises and sets, changing shape over nights that pass without much notice. It feels constant, almost decorative, as if it belongs to the background of the world rather than its foundation. And yet, beneath that quiet presence, something far more significant is taking place. The moon is not just something we see at night. It is something that is still holding the world together. Its influence does not announce itself. It does not draw attention through sudden change or visible force. Instead, it works continuously, shaping the motion of the planet in ways that are too slow and too steady to be easily observed. The tilt of the Earth, which once wandered across wide ranges, remains within limits because of this distant companion. The seasons that follow one another with quiet reliability depend on that stability. Without it, the angle of the planet would shift more freely over time. The patterns of sunlight across the surface would become less predictable, altering climates in ways that would unfold gradually, but persistently. What now feels consistent would begin to change, not suddenly, but in ways that accumulate over long periods. The oceans, too, remain under the moon's influence. Their tides continue to rise and fall, following a rhythm that has become so familiar it is rarely questioned. These movements shape coastlines, distribute nutrients, and support ecosystems that depend on the steady exchange between land and sea. The presence of this rhythm allows processes to continue in patterns that can be relied upon. It is easy to think of these cycles as natural, as if they would exist in the same way regardless of the moon's presence. But they are not independent. They are guided, maintained, and reinforced by the gravitational connection between Earth and its companion. The rhythm of the tides is not simply a feature of the oceans. It is a reflection of an ongoing relationship. Beyond what can be seen directly, the moon contributes to the long-term consistency of the planet's climate. By stabilizing the tilt and influencing the movement of water, it helps maintain the balance of systems that regulate temperature and energy distribution across the Earth. These effects are subtle, unfolding over vast spans of time, but they are essential to the continuity of the environment. There is a quiet realization that begins to emerge here. Many of the conditions that feel permanent are not permanent at all. They are sustained. The predictability of seasons, the stability of ecosystems, the balance of climate, these are not fixed features of the planet. They are the result of ongoing interactions that continue without interruption. The moon, though distant and silent, is part of that process. It does not control the Earth in a direct or immediate way. It does not determine the exact conditions of any single moment. Instead, it shapes the boundaries within which those conditions can exist. It limits extremes, stabilizes patterns, and allows the planet to maintain a state where life can continue to develop and persist. This influence is so constant that it becomes invisible. It fades into the background, becoming part of what is assumed rather than what is noticed. The moon becomes a familiar object in the sky, rather than a force that continues to shape the world. And yet, if that influence were removed, the stability it supports would not remain unchanged. The planet would not simply continue as it is. Over time, the patterns that define it would begin to drift, moving away from the balance that has been maintained for so long. As this realization takes hold, the story begins to shift once more. The familiar becomes uncertain, and the question arises quietly but persistently. What would the world become if that silent influence were no longer there? If the moon were to vanish, the sky would look different, but not immediately unfamiliar. Nights would grow darker. The steady presence that once rose and set would be gone, yet the world itself would continue. The earth would still turn. The sun would still rise. At first, nothing would seem to end, and yet beneath that quiet continuity, something essential would begin to shift. If the moon vanished, nothing would end immediately, but everything would slowly begin to fall out of balance. The change would not announce itself in sudden events. It would unfold over time in ways that would be difficult to notice at first. The most profound shift would occur in the motion of the planet itself. Without the stabilizing influence of the moon, the Earth's axis would begin to wander once more, just as it had in its earliest history. This wandering would not be fast. It would take place over thousands, then millions of years. The tilt of the planet would gradually shift, moving through a wider range than it does now. As it changed, so would the way sunlight reaches the surface. Regions that once experienced familiar seasonal cycles would begin to drift into new patterns. Seasons, as they are known today, would lose their consistency. In some periods, they might weaken, becoming less distinct. In others, they could intensify, stretching into extremes that persist longer than ecosystems are able to adjust to. A region that once supported stable climates might slowly move toward conditions that are far hotter or far colder than before. These changes would not be sudden enough to feel like a catastrophe, but they would be constant enough to reshape the environment over time. The predictability that life depends on would begin to fade. The oceans, too, would begin to change in quieter but equally significant ways. Without the moon's gravitational pull, tides would not disappear entirely, but they would weaken. The subtle influence of the sun would still create movement, but it would lack the strength and consistency that currently defines tidal cycles. Coastlines would experience less variation between high and low water. The dynamic exchange between land and sea would diminish, reducing the mixing of nutrients that supports many marine ecosystems. The shallow environments that once depended on regular tidal movement would become more static, altering the conditions that life has adapted to over immense spans of time. This reduction in movement would extend beyond the edges of the oceans. The circulation of water across the planet, influenced in part by tidal forces, would begin to change. Nutrients would not be distributed as effectively, affecting the balance of life in ways that would unfold slowly but persistently. What emerges from this scenario is not a world that collapses, but a world that loses its coordination. The processes that support life would still exist. The sun would still provide energy. The earth would still rotate. The atmosphere would still hold its composition for some time. But the connection between these processes would begin to weaken. Without the moon's steady influence, the planet would move toward a state where patterns no longer aligan, as they once did. Climate, oceans, and ecosystems would continue, but without the same level of consistency that has allowed them to support complex life. There is a quiet unease in this realization. The stability that feels permanent is not guaranteed. It depends on a relationship that has existed for so long that it has become invisible. The world without the moon is not unrecognizable. It is familiar, but unsettled. It carries the same elements, but they no longer work together in the same way. Over time, that difference would grow, shaping a planet that feels increasingly distant from the one that exists today. And within this imagined future, a deeper understanding begins to form. The conditions that support life, that allow it to grow, adapt, and persist, are not simply features of the Earth. They are the result of interactions that continue to shape the planet in ways that are rarely considered. As this realization settles, the story moves towards something closer, something more immediate. The connection between these ancient processes and the present becomes clearer, revealing how much of what exists today depends on a stability that has been quietly maintained for billions of years. Human history feels recent, immediate, shaped by choices, conflicts, and ideas that seem to belong entirely to our own kind. It is often told as if it began with the first tools, the first settlements, the first words spoken between people who began to understand the world around them. But this story, when viewed more closely, does not begin with humans at all. Human history began with a planet that had already been made stable. Long before the first cities were built, before the first fields were cultivated, the Earth had already passed through transformations that made those moments possible. The steady tilt of the planet ensured that seasons returned in patterns that could be recognized. The cycles of warmth and cold allowed early humans to anticipate changes, to prepare, to plant and harvest at the right times. Agriculture, one of the defining developments of human civilization, depends not only on soil and water, but on consistency. Crops grow within cycles that must repeat year after year. Without predictable seasons, the timing of growth would become uncertain, and the foundation of settled life would weaken. What appears to be a human achievement rests upon a stability that existed long before it was understood. The influence of the moon extends into this foundation in ways that are rarely considered. By stabilizing the Earth's tilt, it helps maintain the seasonal patterns that agriculture relies upon. By shaping the movement of the oceans, it influences coastal environments where many early human communities formed. Along coastlines, tides create rhythms that can be followed. They reveal and conceal resources, gorgadeng patterns of gathering. These cycles, repeating with quiet precision, provide opportunities that early humans learned to recognize and use. Settlements often formed where these patterns could be relied upon, where the environment offered both resources and predictability. Even beyond the direct influence of tides and seasons, the broader stability of the planet plays a role in the development of human societies. Climate patterns that remain within certain limits allow populations to grow, to move, to establish connections across regions. The balance of ecosystems supports the availability of food, water, and materials, all of which are essential for the continuation of human life. It is easy to see human history as something separate from the deeper history of the Earth, as if it exists on its own, shaped only by human decisions. But this perspective overlooks the foundation upon which those decisions are made. The conditions that allow civilization to develop are not random. They are the result of processes that began billions of years ago, unfolding long before humans existed. The moon, distant and silent, is part of that foundation. Its presence, often reduced to a feature of the night sky, continues to influence the conditions that support human life. The stability it helps maintain is not something that draws attention, but it is something that underlies everything that follows. Without it, the patterns that humans rely upon would not exist in the same way. There is a quiet realization in this connection. The story of humanity is not isolated. It is part of a larger narrative, one that extends far beyond individual lifetimes, beyond civilizations, beyond even the existence of our species. It is linked to processes that began when the planet itself was still forming, when the conditions that would eventually support life were only just beginning to emerge. To understand this is to see human history differently. It is not only a story of progress and change within our own species, it is also a continuation of a much older story, one that has been unfolding since the Earth first began to find its balance. And as this understanding settles, the narrative moves toward its final reflection. The connection between past and present becomes clearer, revealing not only how the world came to be as it is, but what that means for the place we occupy within it. The world feels steady. Days follow nights with quiet certainty. Seasons return without question, and the patterns that shape our lives seem as though they have always existed and always will. There is comfort in this consistency, a sense that the ground beneath us, the sky above us, and the rhythms of the planet are fixed parts of reality. It is easy to believe that this stability is permanent. But the most stable world we have ever known is also one of the rarest states a planet can achieve. The story of Earth reveals something different. The calm patterns that define the present were not always there. They did not emerge by default, nor were they guaranteed. They were formed through a sequence of events so unlikely and so interconnected that their outcome cannot be taken for granted. The steady tilt of the planet, the rhythm of the tides, the balance of the atmosphere, all of these are the result of processes that unfolded over immense spans of time. Stability in this sense is not a given, it is an achievement. The planet did not begin in balance. It moved through phases of uncertainty where patterns shifted and conditions changed without consistency. The world we recognize today, with its predictable cycles and stable environments, is the result of those earlier states being transformed, shaped by influences that brought order where there had once been variation without repetition. What makes this realization so subtle is that stability feels natural. It does not draw attention to itself. It allows life to continue without interruption, and because it has been present throughout human history, it appears permanent. But this perception is shaped by a limited perspective. Human experience exists within a narrow window of time, one in which the planet has already reached a state of balance. Beyond that window, the story is very different. The stability we rely on is not fixed. It is maintained through interactions that continue without pause. The tilt of the Earth remains steady because of forces that act continuously. The cycles of the oceans persist because of relationships that have not ceased. The atmosphere holds its composition because life and environment remain connected in ongoing processes. If any of these interactions were to change, the stability they support would begin to shift as well. Not immediately, not in ways that would be obvious at first, but gradually, over time, as the balance that has been established begins to adjust. There is a quiet tension within this understanding. The world is stable but not unchanging. It holds its form but not permanently. The patterns that define it are reliable, but only because they are continuously reinforced. This does not make the world fragile. In a simple sense, it is not on the edge of sudden collapse. But it does mean that what feels constant is part of a system that depends on ongoing relationships. Stability is not the absence of change. It is the result of change that remains within certain limits. To see the world in this way is to recognize that permanence is an illusion. The ground beneath us is part of a system that has evolved, adjusted, and stabilized over time. The sky above us reflects processes that continue to unfold, even when they appear still. This perspective does not remove the sense of stability. It deepens it. It reveals that the balance we experience is not accidental, but the result of conditions that have aligned in a particular way. It invites a different kind of awareness, one that sees the world not as fixed, but as something that is maintained. And as this idea settles, another understanding begins to take shape. If stability is not permanent, then what sustains it becomes more important. The question is no longer whether the world is stable, but how that stability is preserved and what it depends on. From here, the story moves toward that deeper understanding, exploring the processes that continue to maintain balance and the way they shape the world we experience, moment by moment, without ever drawing attention to themselves. The world does not remain stable by holding still. It remains stable because it is always moving, always adjusting, always responding to itself. What appears calm on the surface is the result of countless processes unfolding at once, each one influencing the others in ways that are rarely noticed. The world does not stay stable by remaining still. It stays stable by constantly changing in the right ways. The climate shifts, but within limits. Temperatures rise and fall across seasons and across longer spans of time, yet they remain within ranges that life can endure. The oceans move not only with tides, but through currents that carry heat, nutrients, and energy from one part of the planet to another. The atmosphere circulates, redistributing warmth and moisture, shaping patterns that influence everything from rainfall to wind. None of these systems exist in isolation. They are connected, forming a network where change in one area affects others. A shift in ocean temperature can influence the atmosphere. Changes in the atmosphere can alter patterns of precipitation. These changes, in turn, affect the land and the life that depends on it. Life itself is part of this balance. It does not simply exist within the system, it participates in it. Plants influence the composition of the atmosphere. Microorganisms affect the chemistry of the oceans. Animals interact with ecosystems in ways that shape the distribution of resources. Each of these actions contributes to the overall state of the planet. The moon remains part of this process, continuing to influence the movement of water and the stability of the planet's tilt. Its presence ensures that certain patterns remain consistent, providing a framework within which other processes can operate. But it is not the only factor. Balance is not maintained by a single force. It is sustained by the interaction of many. There is a quiet complexity in this system. It does not follow a simple path or a fixed design. Instead, it adjusts continuously, responding to changes as they occur. When one part of the system shifts, others respond, absorbing the change, redistributing its effects, maintaining the overall balance. This does not mean that the system is unchanging. It evolves over time, moving through different states while remaining within certain limits. Small variations can accumulate, influencing the direction of change over long periods. What remains constant is not the exact conditions, but the ability of the system to remain within a range that supports life. There is a deeper understanding that emerges from this perspective. Stability is not something that happens once and then continues unchanged. It is something that must be maintained moment by moment through interactions that never stop. The balance of the planet is not a static achievement. It is an ongoing process. Even small changes can ripple through this system. A slight shift in temperature, a change in the composition of the atmosphere, an alteration in ocean currents. Each of these can influence other parts of the system in ways that unfold over time. The effects may not be immediate, but they are connected. This does not create a sense of fragility in the way that sudden collapse might suggest. Instead, it reveals a system that is responsive, capable of adjusting to changes while maintaining its overall structure. The balance is not perfect, but it is resilient. To understand the world in this way is to see it as something alive in its own processes. Not in the sense of a single organism, but as a network of interactions that sustain conditions over time. The planet is not simply a place where life exists. It is a system in which life and environment are inseparable. As this understanding settles, the story moves toward its final reflection. The question is no longer only how the world maintains its balance, but what that balance means for everything that exists within it, and how it shapes the path forward in ways that continue to unfold quietly without ever truly coming to an end. The story does not arrive at an ending. It settles into a moment, pauses just long enough to be noticed, and then continues beyond it, carrying everything that has come before into what follows. The rise of balance, the shaping of the planet, the quiet influence of distant forces, none of these are separate events that conclude. They are parts of a sequence that never truly stops. This story does not end with the present, it continues. Quietly, with every passing moment, the Earth still turns. Just as it did in its earliest days, though now with a steadiness that once did not exist. The moon still moves across the sky, maintaining a relationship that has shaped the planet for billions of years. The oceans continue their rhythmic rise and fall, repeating patterns that began long before life reached the land. These processes do not belong to the past. They are happening now, as constant as they are unnoticed. Life, too, continues its movement forward. It evolves, adapts, and responds to the conditions that surround it. The complexity that has emerged is not fixed. It changes, grows, and reorganizes, guided by the same interactions that have always shaped it. Every organism, every ecosystem, exists within this ongoing process, connected to a history that extends far beyond what can be seen. There is a quiet connection between the distant past and the present moment. The instability that once defined the planet, the collision that reshaped it, the gradual emergence of patterns. All of these have led to the world as it exists now. Nothing in this story is isolated. Each part flows into the next, forming a continuity that stretches across time. To recognize this is to see the present differently. The world is not simply a place that exists as it is. It is the result of processes that continue to unfold. The ground beneath your feet, the air you breathe, the rhythm of day and night, all are part of a system that has been shaped over immense spans of time and is still being shaped now. There is no clear boundary between what has happened and what is happening. The same forces that once guided the planet through its earliest transformations remain active, though they move quietly without drawing attention. The balance that defines the world is not a finished state. It is something that is maintained, moment by moment, through interactions that never cease. In this way, the story expands rather than concludes. It invites a different kind of awareness, one that sees the present as part of something larger. The patterns that seem ordinary become part of a deeper narrative, one that connects every moment to what came before and what will follow. The moon, distant and constant, continues its silent role. The earth, shaped by its presence, continues to hold the conditions that allow life to exist. And life, in all its forms, continues to move within this balance, shaping and being shaped in return. There is a calmness in this understanding. The story does not need to end because it was never meant to. It continues without urgency, without finality, unfolding at its own pace. And as it does, it carries everything with it, the past, the present, and the possibilities that have yet to emerge. The narrative fades, but the story remains quietly continuing, just as it always has, just as it always will.